So Monica Ramos here. I'm glad to be here today to talk about, open up actually this presentation about the Tax Increment Reinvestment Program. This is a very important educational opportunity to learn about the process and the specific details that go into applying for TIRZ funding. We'll go ahead and talk about what we'll cover today. What is the Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone? What is its purpose? What is the incentive program and how exactly does that work? Who is eligible for the TIRZ program? And what is the process for awarding the grant process? TIRZ was established in 2006 by Downtown San Angelo, Inc. and funded by Downtown San Angelo. The TIRZ program was established to help business owners enhance their properties, rehabilitate their properties, as well as enhance blighted areas. The increased taxes in the area are set aside in a separate fund to finance improvements, both public and private, within the boundaries of the zone. And that's important that I mention boundaries, because only if you are in those boundaries are you eligible for the TIRZ funding and the application process. Downtown San Angelo, Inc. since then handed over the TIRZ program to the City of San Angelo. So I'll go ahead and let John James with the city continue with the rest of the presentation and provide more detailed information.
Thank you. Excuse me. So a tax increment reinvestment zone, what is it? It's a special zone. I'm sorry, I'm John James, Director of Planning. It's a zone created to encourage redevelopment in an area. And so it's the intent under the state law that establishes TIRZ is that it encourages reinvestment in areas that might not otherwise see that reinvestment. So that could be a blighted area, or it could be an area like our downtown that isn't necessarily blighted, but just needs a little extra push to get that development going. So basically the increased taxes in the area from the time that the zone is created, those get set aside into a special fund that then can be used to reinvest in those areas. This graph, it's a little complicated, but it shows if you see the purple area, that's the value at the time the TIRZ was created. So those taxes continue to go to the city and the county just like normal. But as those property values grow over time, that additional or incremental value, that the taxes on that additional value are what gets set aside into a program. So over time, hopefully the values in the zones are going up, and so each year that amount of taxes continues to go up as well. So a common confusion is this does not change the taxes that a business owner pays. They pay the same taxes that they would normally pay, so it's not anything extra on them. It's just the part of the taxes they would normally pay gets set aside into this TIRZ program. The TIRZ is overseen by an appointed board because it is a city and county function. The board is made up of 9 voting members, 7 that are appointed by the city's mayor and council, and then 2 that are appointed by the county. The board also has 5 non-voting members representing the Chamber of Commerce, Downtown San Angelo, Inc., the school district, Goodfellow Air Force Base, and then Angelo State. And so those representatives can attend the meetings and participate, provide their input. They just don't get to vote on the final decisions. Here are the maps of the TIRZ areas. Now, technically there is one TIRZ under the state law. It's one tax increment zone. However, we have split it up into the north and south, but they're not technically 2 separate zones. They are one zone with 2 sub-areas. And although most people don't really care about that distinction, there are some legal distinctions that make that a difference. And so you can see here it's a little bit of an odd shape. Part of the reason for that is under the state law, TIRZ boundaries can only include a certain percentage of residential development. So for example, this little donut hole in the middle is outside the TIRZ because that's mostly residential. And so it picks up the commercial areas largely along Bryant and MLK, and then along Chadburn, as well as up the general area of the north side Walmart. And the south side is mostly the downtown. If you think of the South Tiers. It isn't an exact match with the boundaries of what we consider downtown, but it's pretty close. So what can TIRZ do? There's basically two different things that TIRZ money can go towards. One is public investments. So for example, the recent Chadburn Street project, many of the streetscape elements, sidewalks, street trees, those pieces were paid for out of TIRZ funds, along with a number of other sources as well. So the TIRZ, and in a lot of cities, that's all TIRZ programs do, is fund infrastructure, whether it be sidewalks or roads, water line improvements. But the second big piece that a TIRZ program can do is incentive grants for private development. And so that's what the biggest chunk of the city's TIRZ program goes towards, is those private incentive projects. And so those grants, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but those grants are available to private property owners of up to $75,000 per project. So what can TIRZ fund? It can only fund certain things under our policies, and here's a list of those, including facade improvements. That's one of the big ones: improving the exterior appearance of a building, historic preservation, landscaping, screening of outdoor storage, particularly in the North Tiers. That's something that we're trying to encourage, is some of these lots that are industrial or storage lots, having those property owners go in and put up a screening fence to help improve the aesthetics of the area. Paving, and it's got a star there because paving can only be funded as part of a larger project. So if you're remodeling a building, putting in landscaping, you can also redo your parking lot. But requests that are just to build a parking lot or just to resurface a parking lot, those aren't eligible unless they're part of a larger program. Secondary egress, and these last three, actually, you'll notice most of these categories are for exterior improvements, things that make things look better. These last three are a little bit different because normally we don't fund things that can't be seen. But secondary egress is one thing we can, and that's just a fire code requirement. A lot of downtown buildings don't have a back exit, for example, and to meet the fire code now you have to do that. And so that's one example of something that can be funded. Asbestos abatement is another one, and then fire sprinklers or a monitored smoke alarm system. That's another big one that we see a lot of funding in the city for fire sprinklers, because downtown buildings weren't built with fire sprinklers, but for a lot of new development, commercial development in the downtown, if you're doing significant remodeling of a building, you have to retrofit it with fire sprinklers, and that can get pretty expensive. So that's another internal kind of project that the TIRZ can fund. Three more things that the TIRZ can fund: sales tax rebates for locally purchased materials. So if you're doing a roofing project, for example, and you get roofing materials locally, the sales tax on those can be waived through this program. We can also do a property tax abatement, as well as waivers or reductions of development fees. Now I have a note here, we don't like to do these last three, partly because it's hard to predict how much they're going to be, and we have that $75,000 cap. So it's a lot easier to fund some of these things because you can get to that $75,000 and then you'll just, you'll get a check, versus, for example, the property tax abatement is a portion of your property taxes returned to you over a 10-year period. So that not only gets complicated to track and calculate, but it means you're waiting as a business owner up to 10 years to get all your money back, versus if you're putting in a fire sprinkler, you just get all that money up front. So then how are the projects selected? Well, ultimately, the final decision is by the City Council, but with the TIRZ Board's recommendation. And they look at a whole list of criteria that are in our policy. I didn't list out, there's a list of project criteria in the TIRZ policy incentive guide. And so you can look at that for a breakdown of things like encouraging housing and encouraging commercial and retail development and economic growth. It's a lot of sort of general things, but then the document also clarifies on some things. Some of the primary goals are the appearance, as I mentioned. Exterior improvements to make the downtown look better is a big thing. Improving blighted properties, and a lot of these are sort of, as we get into projects, particularly in the South, we often get requests for projects that total more money than we have available. So we're having to pick and choose. do we fund project A or project B? Well, these are the criteria that the board and council use to judge between one project and another. So, for example, if there's one blighted project, it's a property the building is falling down, versus another one that looks fine, but they just want to repaint and put on some new awnings, then the criteria says that you'll weigh more heavily the one that is blighted already. Similarly, improvements that are visible from the street are prioritized over those that aren't. Occupied buildings are prioritized. So if there's already a business there and they're wanting to improve it, or they're wanting to open a new business, then that's prioritized over somebody who wants to fix up their building but aren't quite sure what they want to go in there. And then projects that expand the tax base or employment are also prioritized over those that may not. And then another criteria is just kind of a general overall investment and fiscal impact. So, for example, the board has recommended projects that maybe the project itself is $1 million project and they're asking for $75,000 from TIRZ, versus a project that's a $100,000 project and they're asking for $75,000 from TIRZ. The bigger project will have a bigger economic impact to the city. So that's a factor that the board can consider. And then just recently, the incentive policy has been revised to create a priority system. Basically, the highest priority projects will be those that build new housing in the downtown, in particular historic preservation, fire sprinkler systems, and building aesthetics. So those projects will get the highest rankings. The next step, the medium priority, are landscaping or other aesthetic improvements to a property, and other health and safety improvements that similar to fire sprinklers, but that's up in the first category. So it'd be things like that secondary egress to meet the fire code. Then lower priority would be internal improvements to a building and signage, exterior signage. And then finally, the lowest priority, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is parking lots and paving. While that can be funded, that's the lowest priority for the board because it's really a very small return on the investment if you're just building a parking lot versus improving a building. So as I mentioned earlier, the maximum award amount is $75,000. There is a match required, and matching funds are basically funds that a property owner has to put into the project themselves. So the TIRZ fund won't provide the full cost of a project, with an exception I'll mention in a minute, but generally the property owner has to put up a portion of the project costs. Basically, as one of the board members said, to have some skin in the game. So it's not just free money, it's something you're putting your money in as well. So the matching is different depending on where you are and how big the project is. Any project in the South Zone requires a 25% match. So in order to get the full $75,000, you would have to have at least a $100,000 project that's moving forward. In the North, it's a 10% match for most projects. But then if it's a project $10,000 or under, then that is no match required. So if, for example, you're wanting to replace some doors and windows on a building and the cost is less than $10,000, then you could get the full amount for that. And so here's a very important note because we've run into this almost every year, every application cycle. Much of the South TIRZ is in our downtown design district, or it's within the historic district downtown. And both of those, if you're in either one of those districts, it requires, any exterior improvements to the building or the property require approval by the Design and Historic Review Commission of the city. And based on a recent change to the TIRZ policy, we will not even accept an application for a project that does not have DHRC approval if that approval is required. And just in this last cycle, this past month, I think we rejected 3 applications in the South because they did not already have that DHRC approval. Now, of course, some of them are already going through that process and will be able to apply the next round, but it did delay them in their project because they didn't already have that approval. So what does the application process look like? Well, for the South projects, we have cycles, and those projects, applications are accepted twice a year, usually in November. It usually opens November 1st, closes November 30th or 31st, how many ever days November has. But for north projects, that was recently changed to allow north projects to apply at any time. And you'll see when we talk about how much funding is available, but there's more funding in the north than we've been able to spend versus in the south, where like I said, we get more applications for projects than we have funding available. So we like to do those in cycles, so we're comparing a number of projects all at once. Applications, as I said, they do have to be complete, and so there's a checklist on the application itself, and if you didn't get one, I think we have copies here. If you don't provide everything listed on that application, it will be returned to you. You can resubmit it, but again, if you don't get it in by that deadline, then you'll have to wait for that next cycle, at least in the South where there is a cycle. Once applications are filed, staff reviews those, number one, to make sure they're complete, to make sure that they're eligible. In the last cycle, we did get a project for a property that was not within the TIRZ boundary. And so that's something we check to make sure they're actually within the boundary and are eligible. And then finally, we look through the list of proposed improvements to make sure all of the improvements are eligible expenses. So for example, this last cycle, we got a couple of projects that included in their list of what they were requesting funds for, things like plumbing work and electrical work inside the building, and those are not eligible expenses under our policy. Then once staff has reviewed it, we take that to the TIRZ board for their recommendation. That usually happens, depending on the timing, either 1 to 2 months after those application deadline and once they're received. So the TIRZ board does meet monthly on the 4th Tuesday of the month. They don't always meet because there's not always items to be considered, and so in any given month, they end up meeting probably, I would guess, 6 to 8 times a year. But anytime we do have incentive applications before them, they'll meet that month. But like I said, we don't always have items for their agendas each and every month. So at the board meeting itself, the staff will present all of the projects. We'll go through and give basically an overview of the project, what's being proposed, how much money is being asked for, and then we'll give a recommendation. We'll use the criteria in the policy and say, okay, this one is for housing or this one's for fire sprinklers, so that's the highest priority. And maybe another one is just for landscaping in a parking lot, so that's lower on the list. And so we'll create this ranking. And in a case where there are more projects than we have funds available, we'll make a recommendation based on those criteria. Okay, we have enough money to fund, 3 out of the 5 projects that have submitted, but not the other 2. But then it's up to the board. They don't have to approve what staff has recommended. They can change that. In one case a couple of years ago, they decided to fund all the projects just at a portion of what they asked for. So they basically said all of the projects, we're going to give them 75% of what they asked for across the board. That way everybody got money. In this last round, they did the opposite. They funded all they could with the money available, and then all the projects that fell below that line in the ranking just didn't get any funding. And of course, we always encourage those to reapply. We've had a number of projects that got denied funding one cycle, reapplied the next time, and then moved up the list and got funded. So we always encourage people, if you don't succeed the first time, try again. There is an opportunity for public comment at the TIRZ board meeting. So if you, as an applicant, we always encourage you to come to that meeting. Sometimes the board has questions about what it is you're doing. Sometimes they'll have questions. For example, maybe a year ago, we had a project, they were asking for a fire sprinkler and building improvements. And the board decided we didn't have enough money to fund both, so they asked the applicant, if we were just going to give you money for one or the other, which one of those would you rather us fund? And so the applicant was there to say, okay, we think the fire sprinkler is more important, so if you're just going to fund one thing, let's do that. It also gives you an opportunity to make your case as an applicant for how your project benefits the community. Again, as the board is trying to judge between multiple projects, being there to make your case is often very helpful. As I said, the TIRZ board makes a recommendation, they take a vote. That recommendation will then go to the city council. Typically that's about a month after the TIRZ board meeting, depending on the timing of when the meetings fall, the dates. And then again, the staff will present the TIRZ board's recommendation to the city council. Many times that's just on the city council's consent agenda, which means it may not be considered separately unless a council member asks for it to be considered separately. So as an example, next Tuesday, the TIRZ board, the TIRZ projects that were recommended by the board last month are going to the city council on Tuesday next week. That is on the consent agenda. So we will not be making a presentation unless the city council asks to pull it off of that and ask any questions or ask us to present. But normally the TIRZ board recommendation is passed on as is to the city council, and 9 times out of 10 they'll approve what the TIRZ board approved. But sometimes they do pull it off, ask questions, maybe make some changes to the funding amounts, but that's not real common. So what happens next? Do not begin the project at this point. Even though it's been approved by city council, there has to be a development agreement in place. That usually doesn't take that long to get in place, but it is a standard agreement that the city agrees to give you that money. The applicant agrees to do all the things they promised to do. And once that agreement's signed by both the city officials as well as the applicant, then we will send a letter to proceed or a notice to proceed, and that's the point at which you can start spending the money and doing the project. And so again, this is partly based on the requirements of state law. You cannot start the project if you've done any of the work prior to that letter to proceed. We cannot reimburse those expenses. It is a reimbursement program, so the property owner does have to make all the improvements up front. So you have to come up with the funds to actually make it happen, and then you can present to the city your invoices. We often ask for pictures and things to make sure the work was actually done, and then you can get that reimbursement at the end of the project. We had a question come up at a town hall meeting that we had recently, and we had a couple local bankers there, and I know at least one of our local banks has worked with TIRZ applicants, and they'll give them a loan based on the approval of the TIRZ funding. So if we give you $75,000 in TIRZ funding, and you can't come up with that $75,000 up front, there's an opportunity for a bank loan for that $75,000, and then you just pay the bank back once you get that those funds at the end of the project. I will caution you, we've had a couple of applicants. It's pretty rare, but we have had 2 or 3 that have not been able to finish their project, and so have not been able to get the funding that they were promised. Again, that agreement says we'll give you the money if you do the work you said you would do. In one case, there were just some timing issues. This was during COVID. The building materials just got so expensive they couldn't make it work, and so they just had to back out of the project. But they were out some of the costs that they had already put into the project because they weren't able to complete it. We used to give a 10% of the funding up front. We don't do that anymore, but in a couple of those cases, those folks had already been given that 10% up front, and they actually had to pay that back as well. So just a cautionary note, especially if you're looking at taking out a loan to do a project, you have to make sure you complete it, because we won't pay the money out until it's complete. So how much funding is available right now? And this is before, as I mentioned, there's projects going next week to City Council. These numbers are before those expenditures, because they technically haven't been approved yet. But in the north, we have about 2.3 million available in the north zone. So if you or anyone you know have businesses or properties in the north zone, there is significant funding available to make improvements to properties up there. In the south, it's lower. It's about 265,000, and I think the projects that were just approved are in the neighborhood of 200,000, maybe 180, somewhere in there. And so there will be funds left. We will have a cycle coming up in April, but there won't be a lot of funds left. These are for the fiscal year. which ends in September. And so, again, we'll be accepting some projects, but there won't be a lot of funding available. I note here that these numbers at the bottom are what's already been committed. These are funds that projects that have been approved and just not completed. So if you apply and your project gets approved, and let's say you were approved for $75,000, we take that money out of this pot at the beginning, so that money is no longer available. It gets set aside separately so that when you complete the project, that money's there to pay out. Some TIRZ programs in other cities do it a little bit differently. They just kind of keep it rolling and assume money will come in to pay what has to go out. We're a little more conservative fiscally with that. Once we promise the money, we set it aside and it can't be touched for anything. And like I said, some of these projects can take a year, 2 years, 3 years, so that money sits there so it's still available when those people come in. So we do have some other set-asides for the Chadbourne Street project, and those are the totals right now. One of the things the City Council did 2 or 3, 4 years ago was set aside a percentage of the TIRZ funds each year, I think for 8 years. And so, for example, that $265,000 in the South, that would be a little bit higher, except 25% of the available funds were taken off the top to put into that Chadbourne Street set-aside. And so I want to say we're in year 4 or 5 maybe of the 8 years. So in 3 or 4 more years, the available funds will go back up because that Chadbourne Street project will have been paid off. So here are some frequent questions. I tried to answer a lot of the questions we get in the course of the slides you've already seen, but here are some things that have come up that we often get asked. Number one, can I apply for multiple projects? The short answer is no. One business, one property can only apply for one project per cycle. Now there are a couple of wrinkles to that. We had one that was one property but 2 businesses on the same property. We considered that 2 separate projects, so even though it was the same owner. He applied for $75,000 for the one business, $75,000 for the other business, and because they were 2 separate businesses, those both could get funding separately. We've actually got another one that requested funding that's going to City Council next week that's similar. It's one shopping center that's all one building, but it's got 4 separate businesses within it, like a typical shopping center. And so each of those got their own separate funding. But now you can apply multiple times. We've had businesses come back 2, sometimes 3 times and ask for additional funding. So the first time, I mentioned the one with the fire sprinkler. The board told them we can't fund both. Now we're going to fund fire sprinkler. They have since come back, and I believe it's on the ones that are going next Tuesday. They came back with the facade improvements that they didn't get the last time and are getting approved for those as well. So you can come back multiple times. Now I will say, I didn't mention this earlier, one of the criteria as we're judging projects against each other, if a project has received money recently, the board can use that as a balancing. They would rather give money to some business that has not received funds over somebody who already has. But again, that's a judgment call based on some of the other criteria because I know we have had folks get funding a second and third time. Another question we get is, I didn't know about this. How do we find out about this program? Well, one of the things is doing things like today. We've held some town hall meetings. We're doing presentations like this to try to help get the word out. I know the Small Business Development Center in recent months has worked to get the word out as well, even doing some Spanish language radio, for example, because we found on the North Tiers particularly a lot of those business and property owners are Spanish speakers and some of them don't speak English at all. And so some of the things we're sending out to property owners, we've done mailers door to door, but if that's in English and you don't speak English, it's hard to get that information out. So we're trying to get the word out on the program. Also working with Downtown San Angelo, they are also part of the outreach for this program to try to help get the word out, particularly in the north. Again, we're getting more people asking for money in the south than we have money, so word's definitely getting out there. On the north side is where we're really trying to focus now because, like I said, we've got over $2 million. That's a lot of projects that we could fund up there. We also get the question, why is my property outside the TIRZ? Well, the boundary had to be drawn somewhere, and that's where it was drawn back in 2006 when it was created. Another question we often get immediately after that answer is, well, can it be changed? The short answer is yes, but the longer answer is it's a complicated process and it changes the funding mechanisms. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, the taxes that go into the TIRZ fund are only on that incremental difference. If we were to add property today, that base value would be today's value, and the increment is only above that. And so that creates some additional problems in terms of accounting and with the appraisal district. This has come up, I think, at least twice, maybe 3 times in the last 7 or 8 years. And each time both the board and the city council have said, no, we like the boundaries where they are, we're not going to expand. And then really any other questions, I think that's kind of my overview of the program, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if you all have specific questions about the program.
I have something to say.
Sure.
So you mentioned Downtown San Angelo. We recently came back into the big picture of the TIRZ program to help out with the administrative process for the city, kind of help them with their workload that they have going on. So any applications for the north or the south can be brought to Downtown San Angelo Inc.'s office at 24 West Concho Avenue. And so we'll collect your application. We don't have any part in the decision making, but that's where you will come to turn in your application, and then from there we will hand it off to the city. But we'll make sure and go through the checklist and make sure that you have your summary, your narrative, your W-9, any other necessary documents or renderings of your project to turn in with your application. Make sure you have your full packet ready to go to be turned into the city, and then from there it goes on with the next steps of the TIRZ process. So I just wanted to mention that. You can reach out to us by phone also at 325-655-2345. Visit our website, downtownsanangelo.com, or shoot us an email at info@dtsa.org.
That's a good question. Yes. I believe our TIRZ was for 25 years, and so at the end of 25 years, it will expire and basically go away. Now, there is an option to extend it. I don't know all the details of that. I think as we get closer to that 25 years, which is coming up in not too long, we'll want to look at that and see if it's something that we'll want to continue. One of the issues with that is we don't know if some of the information we've gotten would suggest that the county may not want to participate. So if we do extend it, it might be only the city taxes that go into it, which will decrease the amount of funding availability. But again, the short answer is it will expire after 25 years unless it's extended. I'm glad you asked. Yes, I meant to mention that. I may have even had it on a slide. Yes, currently nonprofit organizations, churches, other nonprofits are not eligible in the South. In the North area, they are eligible, but the board and city council both have to make a finding that it is providing an economic benefit of some sort to the city, and it requires a 3/4 majority vote by both the board and the city council. And so that's a high bar, basically. The city council has directed us to take to the board an item for discussion, which will be going to their next meeting here in towards the end of February, to consider removing that and not allowing nonprofits to get funding at all. Especially people watching this online, you may want to double check, because by the time you watch this, that may have changed. But right now, nonprofits in the North are eligible, but it does require 3/4 of the entire board, which makes it even higher burden, because in the case of TIRZ, the board, That's 7 out of 9 of all of the board members. And so, for example, we had a project at the last meeting, there were only 7 members present. They voted 6-1 to approve the project. That didn't get to the 7 votes, so technically that was not approved.
And I'll add that the TIRZ application process is a little tedious, time consuming. There's a lot of documents to put together and gather, but it's just like any other free available money and grant funding. You do have to provide your documentation in order to have that approval. So it's well worth the time and effort put into it, and it does take some patience because it is about a 2 to 3 month process. So you'll want to make sure that you have everything that you need and all of your information in line. I was also going to mention something else, but I've forgotten. I'll come back to it.
Well, I would piggyback on that and say one thing that applicants sometimes don't pay as much attention to is the impact statement and the description of the project. The more you can tell about what your project is doing, and you know, and in terms of explaining, drawings are always great. You know, like you don't necessarily have to go get an architect to do a complicated rendering, but that's helpful. And getting, I think if there's 2 projects and one is just, hey, I want this much money for these 3 things, and the other one is that information on what they're asking for, but also a half-page description of here's what we're doing and why we think it'll help our property, why it'll help our business. You know, those details often make a difference between a project that's approved and not approved.
Okay, and I found my lost thought. I wanted to mention that it must be the property owner who submits the application, makes the arrangements for the property. It cannot be the business owner. It must be the property owner.
Well, I'll say we do have some of that information on our website. We're actually going through a process right now of reviewing our website, and we have a list of some things that we want to improve. I'll also say, you mentioned Costa DC. There's been a little bit of a reorganization, so now the entire TIRZ program is under Planning and Development Services. So nothing is handled here at Costa DC Economic Development anymore. And so I don't know if they have information on their website still, but that's something we could look at and maybe move some of that over to the Planning and Development Services website. But that's a pretty recent change. But in addition to working with Downtown San Angelo on applications, our staff in Planning and Development Services, and I got Brian's name. Brian is the coordinator of that program in our office at the city. And so he can also answer questions if there's questions about the application or the process or the timing of deadlines and things.